Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1864. New Orleans had fallen to Union forces 2 years prior, its streets now patrolled by soldiers in blue uniforms who seemed as foreign to the locals as if they'd arrived from another continent. The humid air clung to everything, a constant reminder that in this city nothing ever truly dried out or disappeared. Not the moisture, not the memories, not the secrets buried in the crumbling walls of the French Quarter. In a modest 2-story home on Dauphine Street, just 3 blocks from the Mississippi River, lived the Murphy sisters, Agnes, Elizabeth, and Margaret. They were known among the locals for their reserved nature and their unusual profession. The sisters operated what they called a scientific salon, where they conducted experiments that blended chemistry, biology, and what some whispered was something far more unorthodox. Their clientele consisted primarily of wealthy women who sought remedies that conventional medicine of the time couldn't or wouldn't provide. The Murphy sisters were educated, unusual for women of their time. Their father, Dr. James Murphy, had been a physician who studied in Edinburgh before settling in New Orleans in the 1830s. When yellow fever claimed him in 1855, he left behind not only his 3 daughters, but a substantial library of medical texts, scientific journals, and private notebooks filled with observations that straddled the line between documented science and theoretical speculation. According to parish records, the Murphy family had originally arrived in New Orleans in 1832 when James Murphy was recruited to help combat one of the city's devastating yellow fever outbreaks. His wife, Catherine, was herself the daughter of a prominent Boston physician and had received an unusually thorough education for a woman of her era. Together, they established a small but respected medical practice catering primarily to the city's growing Irish community. Catherine died in childbirth in 1836 while delivering what would have been the couple's 4th child, a son who also did not survive. Left with 3 young daughters, Dr. Murphy made the unconventional decision to educate them himself rather than focusing exclusively on the domestic arts typical for young women of their station. His colleagues reportedly criticized this approach, but Dr. Murphy was known to have remarked, "Their minds are as capable as any man's, and in these uncertain times, they must be equipped to make their own way." The girls grew up surrounded by medical texts, scientific discussions, and their father's constant experimentations. Their home functioned partly as a doctor's office, and from an early age, the sisters were exposed to the realities of illness, treatment, and occasionally death. Neighbors later recalled seeing the girls assisting their father, even as children, sterilizing instruments, preparing compounds, and eventually helping with basic procedures. Dr. Murphy's approach to medicine was considered progressive for his time. He was an early advocate for hygiene practices, regularly corresponding with physicians in Europe who were beginning to connect cleanliness with reduced infection rates. His journals, portions of which were preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society archives until they mysteriously disappeared in 1965, revealed a mind open to new ideas, yet rigorously methodical in testing them. By the time Agnes reached 18, she was effectively functioning as her father's nurse and assistant. Elizabeth, 2 years younger, showed a particular aptitude for chemistry and the preparation of medicines. Margaret, the youngest, was described in family correspondence as having an unusual sensitivity to the suffering of others and a gift for calming distressed patients. When yellow fever swept through New Orleans again in 1855, Dr. Murphy worked tirelessly among the sick. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, he had developed what he believed was a more effective treatment regimen, focusing on maintaining hydration and body temperature rather than the bloodletting and purging common at the time. For weeks, he moved from home to home throughout the infected districts, his daughters often accompanying him to assist with care. The New Orleans Daily Picayune of September 12, 1855, noted, Dr. Murphy and his dedicated daughters continue their tireless efforts among the afflicted, even as many other practitioners have fled the city. Their methods, while unconventional, appear to offer some improvement in survival rates. In early October, Dr. Murphy himself began showing symptoms. Agnes took over his practice while Elizabeth and Margaret tended to their father. Despite their best efforts, James Murphy died on October 17, 1855. The sisters buried him in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where his modest tombstone can still be seen today, bearing the inscription, "He sought truth through science and compassion." Following their father's death, the Murphy sisters faced a choice that confronted many unmarried women of their era. Seek marriages, find employment in one of the few respectable occupations open to women, or rely on the charity of relatives. Instead, they chose a fourth path. Using their inheritance and the knowledge they had gained at their father's side, they transformed their home into what they termed a scientific salon, focusing primarily on women's health issues. This was a bold step in the 1850s, when female practitioners were generally limited to midwifery and basic nursing. Yet the sisters had several advantages: their father's reputation, their own considerable knowledge, and a network of patients already familiar with their capabilities. They also benefited from the social disruption of the era, as the approaching Civil War began to break down traditional structures and limitations. By 1860, the Murphy sisters' practice was well established. They served a diverse clientele, from wealthy women of the Garden District to the working-class Irish and Creole communities. They were known for their discretion, their gentle manner, and, most importantly, for achieving results where male physicians had failed, particularly in matters related to fertility, menstrual difficulties, and the various female complaints that conventional medicine of the time handled poorly. The sisters developed a reputation for effective treatments. What exactly those treatments entailed became the subject of much speculation, both during their lifetime and in subsequent historical analysis. The few surviving records suggest a blend of approaches: herbal remedies based on both European and local traditions, dietary adjustments, physical therapies, and increasingly experimental techniques developed through their own research. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 initially had little impact on their work. New Orleans, protected by its position on the Mississippi and the ring of forts guarding the approaches to the city, continued its daily rhythms largely unchanged. The sisters, like many residents, believed the conflict would be brief and that the South's independence was assured. The fall of New Orleans to Union forces in April 1862 shattered that illusion. Under the harsh military governorship of General Benjamin Butler, dubbed Beast Butler by the locals, the city entered a period of occupation that brought new hardships and restrictions. Many businesses closed. Social life contracted. Resources became scarce. For the Murphy sisters, however, the occupation presented both challenges and opportunities. Medical supplies were increasingly difficult to obtain through normal channels, forcing them to develop alternatives using locally available materials. At the same time, the presence of Union military personnel created new avenues for acquiring scientific journals, equipment, and chemicals from northern sources. A ledger recovered from their home, covering the period from June 1862 to December 1863, reveals an interesting pattern. While the sisters continued treating their established patients, they also began recording a series of experimental protocols with coded references to energy transference, vital, restoration, and balance equilibrium between subjects. These entries became increasingly frequent and detailed throughout 1863, suggesting an escalation in whatever research they were conducting. Several entries make reference to a donor group A and recipient group B, with meticulous notes on physical responses, recovery rates, and energy retention duration. The scientific language used suggests legitimate research methodology, yet the subject matter remains obscure enough that even modern analysts cannot determine exactly what procedures were being performed. What happened in February of 1864 would forever alter how the scientific community viewed the sisters' work, though most of the details were purposefully buried, mentioned only in hushed tones by medical professionals who feared association with what they called the Murphy incident. On February 23, 1864, Elizabeth Murphy, the middle sister at 32 years of age, walked into the Union-controlled City Hall and requested to speak with the military governor. When denied, she left a sealed envelope with a clerk. The contents of that envelope would not be made public until 1952, when historian Walter Pritchard uncovered it in the Louisiana State Archives. What he found was a 16-page document written in Elizabeth's precise handwriting, detailing what she called a profound discovery that science refuses to acknowledge. By the time authorities arrived at the Dauphin Street home later that afternoon, Elizabeth had returned to find her sisters engaged in what the official report described as experimental procedures of an unusual nature. The responding officers, according to their statements, were instructed to bring the women to the military hospital for evaluation. What they found instead has been described in conflicting accounts. Lieutenant James Harrell wrote in his report, "The premises contained scientific equipment of European manufacture, much of it unknown to our medical officer. The basement area had been converted into a laboratory space with extensive notes and diagrams covering the walls. The air carried a distinctive odor reminiscent of medicinal ether, but with underlying notes that our physician could not identify." In a separate account, discovered among personal papers donated to Tulane University in 1937, Sergeant William Collins provided additional details. Upon entry to the basement laboratory, we observed 3 women seated around a central table. On the table lay a 4th woman, apparently unconscious but breathing regularly. Connected to this woman's arm was a series of glass tubes leading to a device of brass and crystal construction. The tubes contained a fluid of deep crimson color, but thicker in consistency than blood, Collins continued. When questioned about the nature of their activities, the eldest sister, identified as Agnes Murphy, responded with remarkable composure, stating that they were conducting a therapeutic treatment for female exhaustion. She presented papers indicating the unconscious woman had provided written consent for the procedure. The sisters were not arrested that day. They were, however, separated and questioned individually for several hours. Margaret, the youngest at 28, reportedly spoke very little. Agnes, the eldest at 35, answered questions calmly and insisted their work was ahead of its time, but fundamentally rooted in sound scientific principles. Elizabeth, however, was described as agitated and insistent that their discoveries be documented before they were suppressed. What exactly were these discoveries? The answer to that question depends entirely on which records you consult. According to the official medical reports filed by the Union Army's chief medical officer in New Orleans, Dr. William Spencer, the Murphy sisters were engaged in the questionable practice of female medical treatments without proper training or certification, a common enough occurrence in the 19th century when women's health was poorly understood and largely neglected by the male-dominated medical establishment. But Elizabeth Murphy's sealed letter told a different story. She wrote of experiments in what she called the transference of vital energy between living organisms. She claimed that they had discovered a method to extract and preserve what she termed life essence from one subject and introduce it to another. The language she used was clinical, detached, as if describing nothing more controversial than a new method for setting a broken bone. "We have documented 47 successful transferences," she wrote. "The subjects demonstrate remarkable improvements in vigor, mental acuity, and resistance to illness. The donor subjects experience temporary debilitation but recover fully within a fortnight when properly nourished and rested." Elizabeth's document included detailed descriptions of their equipment, much of which she claimed to have designed herself, modifying existing medical devices for their specific purposes. Of particular note was what she called a vital essence accumulator, described as a glass chamber containing a solution of our own devising, capable of temporarily housing the extracted essence before transfer. The most controversial aspect of her report was a section titled Theoretical Framework, in which she proposed that all living beings contained a measurable, vital energy distinct from but connected to their physical bodies. This energy, she claimed, could be quantified, extracted, and transferred under the right conditions. She further suggested that certain individuals naturally produced an excess of this energy, while others suffered from a deficiency that led to various ailments. Our research indicates, she wrote, that a properly balanced transfer between compatible subjects results in mutual benefit. The donor, relieved of excess energy that can manifest as nervous complaints, experiences a calming effect. The recipient, supplemented with vital essence they cannot adequately produce themselves, finds relief from lethargy, melancholy, and physical weakness. What Elizabeth didn't explain in her letter, at least not explicitly, was who these donors were, or whether their participation was voluntary. This omission would later be the focus of much speculation. For 3 days following the initial visit from authorities, the Murphy home was placed under observation. Neighbors reported seeing the sisters coming and going, apparently conducting business as usual. On the 4th day, February 27th, smoke was observed rising from the chimney of the house, despite the unseasonably warm weather. According to witness statements, the smoke continued steadily for nearly 5 hours. Mrs. Josephine Beaumont, who lived across the street, later told the New Orleans Daily Crescent, "It was the strangest thing. The smoke wasn't like cooking fire or heating. It was thick and had an unusual color to it, almost bluish. And there was a smell, not unpleasant exactly, but like nothing I'd encountered before. By evening, my silver candlesticks had tarnished completely, though they'd been polished just that morning." When officials entered the home the following morning, they found it meticulously cleaned. The basement laboratory had been stripped of equipment. Bookshelves stood empty. Even the diagrams that had covered the walls were gone, leaving behind only faint outlines where paper had protected the plaster from years of soot and discoloration. The Murphy sisters themselves had vanished. The official record states that an extensive search was conducted throughout New Orleans and the surrounding areas. Ships' manifests were checked. Train stations were monitored. No trace of the 3 women was found. It was as if they had disappeared as completely as their research. One curious detail emerged from the search of their home. In Agnes Murphy's bedroom, investigators found a small leather-bound book concealed beneath a loose floorboard. The book, written in a cipher that took military cryptographers several weeks to decode, contained what appeared to be a patient ledger. It listed dozens of names, some from prominent New Orleans families, alongside dates, mysterious numerical values, and cryptic annotations such as superior donor, compatible match, or insufficient recovery period. This ledger was never made public. According to military correspondence uncovered by Dr. Eleanor Caldwell in 1957, the book was deemed potentially damaging to the reputations of respected citizens and was sealed under the authority of the military governor. Its current whereabouts are unknown. For months afterward, rumors circulated through New Orleans. Some claimed to have seen Agnes boarding a steamer bound for Europe. Others insisted that all 3 women had fled to Mexico. A persistent story suggested they had simply changed their identities and continued their work elsewhere in the city, hidden in plain sight. More disturbing were the whispered accounts of women who had been patients of the Murphy sisters, suddenly experiencing mysterious ailments. These stories, never documented in official medical records, spoke of extreme fatigue, pallid complexions, and a persistent cold that seemed to emanate from within. The case might have remained nothing more than an unusual footnote in New Orleans' colorful history, if not for what happened 9 months later. In November of 1864, Dr. Ambrose Havers, a respected physician who had occasionally consulted with Union medical staff, began treating a patient with unusual symptoms. The woman, whose name was redacted from his records, displayed what he described as a profound lethargy, skin pallor reminiscent of severe anemia, and a body temperature consistently 2 degrees below normal. Despite these concerning symptoms, her pulse remained strong and regular. Dr. Havers noted in his private journal, "Mrs. G presents with a condition I have not previously encountered in 30 years of practice. She describes a sensation of emptiness that is not alleviated by nourishment or rest. Most peculiarly, when I place my hand near, but not touching, her skin, I perceive a distinct coolness in the air, as if heat is being drawn away from her surroundings." When conventional treatments failed to improve her condition, Dr. Havers reportedly consulted his personal library for similar cases. Among his books was a rare medical text authored by Dr. James Murphy, the father of the three sisters. Margin notes in this volume, presumably written by Dr. Murphy himself, described a condition with remarkably similar symptoms. The notes referred to it as vital depletion. According to journal entries found among Dr. Havers's papers after his death in 1881, he began to suspect a connection between his patient's condition and the disappeared Murphy sisters. His suspicions intensified when he learned that his patient had consulted with 3 female practitioners regarding fertility. Treatments approximately 1 month before the onset of her symptoms. Dr. Havers wrote, "Mrs. G has reluctantly admitted to seeking treatment from practitioners she will not name, though her description matches what I know of the Murphy women. She reports an unusual procedure involving the drawing of something more than blood through a device of glass and metal. She was assured this was necessary to prepare her system for the fertility treatment to follow." Dr. Havers allegedly began his own investigation, discreetly inquiring among his patients and colleagues about similar cases. Within weeks, he had identified 7 women suffering from comparable symptoms, all of whom had sought treatments from the same unidentified female practitioners. His journal entry dated November 28, 1864, reveals a growing concern. The pattern becomes increasingly clear, yet remains inexplicable by any medical principles with which I am familiar. These women have been subjected to a procedure that has somehow depleted them of something essential to their vitality. Yet what this essence might be, beyond blood, beyond nervous energy, I cannot say. It is as if some fundamental force has been extracted from their very being. Particularly troubling to Dr. Havers was his discovery that the women who had undergone these procedures reported initially positive results. Several described feelings of transcendent calm and relief from nervous tension immediately following treatment. It was only weeks or months later that the debilitating symptoms began to manifest. On December 3, 1864, Dr. Havers documented his intention to report his findings to the authorities. His journal entry for that date reads, "I can no longer ignore the pattern before me. Though it challenges my understanding of medical science, I must consider the possibility that what the Murphy women claimed in their research has some basis in fact. If so, the implications are both profound and disturbing. I shall present my observations to Captain Wilkes tomorrow morning." Dr. Havers never made that report. On the morning of December 4th, he was found in his office, seated at his desk, apparently having passed peacefully during the night. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, presumably heart failure. He was 59 years old and had no known history of heart ailments. A curious detail, mentioned only in the initial police report and omitted from the official death certificate, was that Dr. Havers' body was described as unusually cold to the touch, more so than can be accounted for by the ambient temperature or the estimated time of death. The reporting officer also noted that the inkwell on the doctor's desk was frozen solid, despite the mild weather. Following Dr. Havers' death, his papers were collected by his nephew, who had little interest in medicine and even less in his uncle's apparent obsession with the Murphy case. The journals and notes were stored in the attic of the family home, where they remained undisturbed for decades. In 1912, the Havers home was sold, and during renovations, the collection of papers was discovered. By chance, the new owner was a physician with an interest in medical history. Dr. Thomas Blackwood recognized the potential historical value of the documents and donated them to Tulane University's medical library. There they remained, catalogued but largely unexamined, until 1957, when medical historian Dr. Eleanor Caldwell began researching 19th-century women's health practitioners in Louisiana. Her attention was drawn to Dr. Haver's journals by a library assistant who remembered the unusual nature of the documents. Dr. Caldwell's subsequent paper, The Murphy Sisters, Science, Superstition or Something Else?, published in the Journal of Medical History in 1959, brought the case to broader academic attention. Her meticulous cross-referencing of Dr. Haver's accounts with official records, newspaper reports, and other contemporary sources painted a compelling picture of the events of 1864. Most significantly, Dr. Caldwell uncovered evidence suggesting that the Murphy sisters had not, in fact, disappeared in February of 1864. She found a lease agreement, dated March 1864, for a property on the outskirts of New Orleans, signed by a Mrs. Agnes Montgomery. The handwriting, when compared to known samples of Agnes Murphy's writing, appeared identical. Further investigation revealed that Mrs. Montgomery and her two sisters-in-law operated what was described as a women's health clinic at this location for approximately 8 months. Local records indicated that the women were well respected for their treatments of female complaints and were particularly sought after by women of means who had difficulty conceiving. According to the Journal of Julia Winters, wife of a Union officer stationed in New Orleans, the Montgomery Clinic was a haven of scientific understanding in a desert of medical ignorance regarding women's conditions, Mrs. Winters wrote in April 1864. The elder Mrs. Montgomery examined me with more thoroughness and dignity than any male physician has ever shown. Her questions were precise, her manner reassuring. The treatment itself was unusual, involving a device of glass, tubes, and a curious brass mechanism, but I felt only a mild sensation of warmth followed by the most profound relaxation I have ever experienced. Another account from the diary of Sophia Latrobe described a different experience. I was taken to a dimly lit room where the youngest sister, Miss Wilson, they called her, explained I was to be a donor for another patient suffering from excess animation of the nerves. The procedure was not uncomfortable, merely strange. A sensation of coolness spread through my arm as they drew something from me, not blood, or at least not merely blood. Afterward, I slept more soundly than I have in years. The clinic closed abruptly in late November 1864, coinciding with Dr. Haver's investigation and subsequent death. The whereabouts of Mrs. Montgomery and her companions after this point remained unknown until 1957, when Dr. Caldwell's research led her to census records from Charleston, South Carolina. The 1870 census listed an Agnes Montgomery, widow, operating a ladies' boarding house with 2 other women identified as Elizabeth Smith and Margaret Wilson. All 3 were listed with ages that matched the Murphy sisters. The boarding house, according to local business records, catered primarily to women of gentle birth and delicate condition, a common euphemism of the time for pregnant women seeking discretion. Dr. Caldwell's investigation of the Charleston boarding house revealed another layer to the sisters' activities. Among the city's medical records, she found references to a series of unusual births at the establishment between 1871 and 1873. Several local physicians noted that infants born there displayed extraordinary vigor and alertness that they attributed to the superior care and innovative nutritional practices employed by Mrs. Montgomery. More intriguing were the records of the women who gave birth at the boarding house. Prenatal examinations consistently described them as being in exceptional health, with a vitality beyond what one might expect in their condition. These women typically stayed at the boarding house for several months before delivery and often remained for weeks afterward, during which time they reportedly received specialized treatments to restore their strength. Dr. Caldwell attempted to trace the women beyond 1870, but found the trail increasingly difficult to follow. The Charleston boarding house closed in 1873, and the women appeared to separate after that point. The last definitive record she uncovered was a death certificate for an Elizabeth Smith, dated 1885, in Baltimore, Maryland. The cause of death was listed as consumption. Curiously, the physician who signed Elizabeth Smith's death certificate, Dr. Harrison Phillips, was known for his research into tuberculosis treatments. His papers, preserved at Johns Hopkins University, contain several references to a remarkable patient whose theories, while unorthodox, led to promising experimental approaches. Though he never named this patient, the timing and descriptions have led some historians to speculate that Elizabeth Murphy, living under her assumed identity, continued her medical research until her death. What makes the Murphy case particularly compelling is not just the mysterious circumstances of their disappearance or the unusual nature of their work, but the scientific implications of what they claim to have discovered. In an era when the germ theory of disease was still gaining acceptance, when anesthesia was relatively new, and when bloodletting was still practiced, the concept of transferring vital energy between individuals seems like little more than pseudo-scientific fancy. Yet the detailed notes that Elizabeth Murphy provided to the military governor describe procedures and outcomes with a precision that suggests genuine scientific observation. She included tables of measurements, descriptions of equipment modifications, and methodical documentation of results that followed the scientific method as it was understood at the time. One passage in particular stands out for its prescience. We have observed that the vital essence carries with it certain characteristics of the donor. Recipients who receive multiple transfers from the same donor begin to exhibit subtle shifts in temperament and predilections that mirror those of the donor. This suggests that the essence contains not merely energy but some form of information, a pattern or code that influences the recipient's own nature. In 1962, biochemist Dr. Lawrence Patel revisited the Murphy documents as part of a broader study on the history of energy transfer concepts in medicine. His analysis, published in the American Journal of Medical Sciences, concluded that while much of the Murphy sisters' theoretical framework was obviously flawed by modern standards, certain aspects of their work seemed to anticipate later discoveries in the field of blood transfusion, hormone therapy, and cellular regeneration. Dr. Patel wrote, "While couched in the language and limited understanding of their time, the Murphy protocols suggest they had stumbled upon some genuine physiological process that allowed for the transfer of certain biological components from one individual to another with measurable effects. What they interpreted as vital energy may well have been early observations of hormonal or immunological factors that would not be properly identified for decades." He further noted, "The sisters' description of personality changes following multiple transfers between the same individuals bears an intriguing resemblance to what we now know can occur with certain types of bone marrow transplants, where recipients sometimes report shifts in preferences and personality traits that align with those of their donors. In the context of 1860s medicine, such observations would have seemed nearly supernatural." Dr. Patel's most controversial speculation concerned the Murphy sisters' vital essence. Accumulator, the device they claimed could temporarily store extracted energy. "If we set aside the pseudo-scientific terminology," he wrote, "and consider what might actually have been happening, one possibility is that they had developed a method for concentrating certain blood components, perhaps plasma proteins or specific cellular fractions, that could then be administered to another individual with therapeutic effect." This scientific reassessment of the Murphy case might have led to further investigation if not for the controversy that erupted following the publication of Dr. Patel's paper. Several prominent medical historians criticized his analysis as giving undue credibility to what they maintained was nothing more than 19th century quackery. Others suggested that even if the Murphy sisters had made genuine observations, their methods almost certainly involved unethical practices that should not be legitimized through serious scientific consideration. The debate became so heated that Dr. Patel eventually distanced himself from the subject entirely and the Murphy documents were once again relegated to historical curiosity rather than scientific interest. In 1967, novelist Harriet Stanton published The Vital Transfer, a fictionalized account of the Murphys, case that portrayed the sisters as early feminists using their scientific knowledge to help women at a time when conventional medicine often failed them. The novel was popular but took significant liberties with the historical record, further blurring the line between fact and fiction surrounding the case. In Stanton's novel, the Murphy sisters were depicted as brilliant scientists battling against patriarchal oppression. Their vital essence transfer was portrayed as a metaphor for women supporting one another in a hostile world. The book's popularity led to renewed public interest in the historical case, though many readers mistakenly accepted Stanton's fictional embellishments as fact. The last significant research into the Murphy sisters occurred in 1968, when Dr. Caldwell, nearing the end of her career, made one final attempt to trace the fate of Agnes and Margaret Murphy. Her search led her to a small cemetery in Alexandria, Virginia, where she found a gravestone bearing the name Agnes Montgomery, 1829-1898. Archival records indicated that Agnes had lived her final years in a modest home, supported financially by what was described as investments and private arrangements. She was remembered by neighbors as a reserved woman who rarely received visitors and never spoke of her past. After her death, her personal effects were claimed by a woman who identified herself as a niece, but left no name or forwarding address. Among Agnes Montgomery's belongings, according to the executor's inventory, was a small wooden box containing 3 glass vials of an unidentified substance. These vials were described as hermetically sealed and containing a thick, amber-colored liquid. They were listed as having been disposed of as requested in the deceased's will, though no further details were provided. Dr. Caldwell also discovered a series of letters exchanged between Agnes Montgomery and a Dr. Frederick Lansing of Philadelphia between 1890 and 1897, while the letters themselves discussed only general medical topics. An encoded notebook found among Agnes's possessions, which Dr. Caldwell managed to partially decipher, suggested that Dr. Lansing was continuing some aspect of the Murphy sisters' research under Agnes's distant guidance. No trace of Margaret Murphy after 1873 has ever been found. What are we to make of the Murphy sisters and their claims? Were they educated women pushing the boundaries of 19th century science, as Elizabeth's detailed notes suggest? Were they charlatans preying on desperate women, as some contemporary accounts implied? Or were they something in between, practitioners working at the edge of conventional knowledge, perhaps making genuine observations but interpreting them through a flawed theoretical framework? The physical evidence that might have answered these questions was thoroughly destroyed when the sisters abandoned their Dauphine Street home. The few documents that survived provide tantalizing glimpses, but no definitive answers. What we do know is that multiple women in New Orleans experienced unusual symptoms after treatments by female practitioners matching the Murphy sisters' description. We know that a respected physician found these symptoms concerning enough to investigate, only to die unexpectedly before reporting his findings. We know that the sisters changed their identities and continued some form of practice in at least 2 other cities after leaving New Orleans. Perhaps most intriguingly, we know that Elizabeth Murphy was absolutely convinced of the validity of their discoveries, convinced enough to risk exposure by submitting her research to authorities in the midst of a military occupation. The historical context adds another dimension to the mystery. The 1860s was a period of significant change in medical understanding. Pasteur's germ theory was gaining acceptance. The stethoscope had been invented only a few decades earlier. Anesthesia was revolutionizing surgery. Against this backdrop of rapid advancement, the idea that 3 self-educated women might have stumbled upon something beyond the understanding of conventional medicine becomes somewhat more plausible. Moreover, the Civil War created unprecedented opportunities for medical innovation. With thousands of wounded soldiers requiring treatment, experimental procedures became more common, and the boundaries of acceptable practice expanded. Women entered the medical field in greater numbers, primarily as nurses, but occasionally in more specialized roles. The Murphy sisters, with their unusual background and skills, were positioned at a unique intersection of opportunity and need. One persistent theory, advanced by Dr. Caldwell and later elaborated by other researchers, suggests that the Murphy sisters had discovered some early form of hormone therapy. The symptoms described in their patients, both positive and negative, align in some ways with what we now know about hormonal imbalances. Their references to donors and recipients could be interpreted as an early understanding that certain individuals produce hormones in different amounts, and that these substances could be transferred with therapeutic effect. Another theory, more controversial but supported by certain passages in Elizabeth's notes, is that the sisters had developed a technique for transferring blood components beyond simple transfusion. Their description of their vital essence accumulator suggests a device capable of separating and concentrating specific elements from blood, perhaps an early, crude form of plasmapheresis or component separation. In her final documented words written in the conclusion of her letter to the military governor, Elizabeth wrote, "I understand that our findings may seem impossible by current scientific understanding. I accept that we may be dismissed, even ridiculed. But I cannot remain silent when we have uncovered a principle so fundamental to human vitality. Science progresses when we have the courage to see beyond our limitations. History will vindicate our work, even as the present refuses to accept it," she continued. "We have mapped what we believe to be the channels through which vital essence flows within the human form. We have measured its quantity and quality in dozens of subjects. We have developed means to extract it without harm, to preserve it without deterioration, and to transfer it with precision. That such a fundamental aspect of human physiology has remained undetected by conventional science speaks not to the fantastical nature of our claims, but to the limitations of current medical philosophy. The house on Dauphine Street still stands, though it has been renovated many times over the intervening century and a half. Current owners report no unusual occurrences, no lingering sense of the building's mysterious past. The basement where the Murphy sisters conducted their experiments is now a casual dining area in a tourist-friendly bed and breakfast. Occasionally, guests familiar with the story ask about the Murphy sisters' house, but most staff members know little beyond vague details of some medical ladies who once lived there. Time has softened the edges of the mystery, reduced it to little more than local color in a city already rich with tales of the unusual and unexplained. Yet in certain academic circles, the Murphy case continues to provoke discussion. Modern understanding of stem cells, regenerative medicine, and energy transfer at the cellular level has given some researchers reason to wonder if the sisters had indeed observed something genuine, something their era lacked the framework to properly understand or explain. Dr. Miranda Chen, writing in the Journal of Historical Medicine in 1966, observed, "When we strip away the 19th century terminology and look at the actual procedures and outcomes described in the Murphy documents, we find observations that align remarkably well with our current understanding of immune function, cellular signaling, and bioelectrical fields within the body. Had they possessed the vocabulary and conceptual framework we now take for granted, their work might have been recognized as pioneering rather than dismissed as pseudoscience." In 1965, neurologist Dr. Samuel Weiss wrote in a private letter to a colleague, "What if the Murphy women were right? What if they had discovered some method of transferring biological components that enhance cellular function? The ethical questions would be troubling, certainly, but the scientific implications would be profound. Sometimes I wonder if we've dismissed them too easily, simply because they were women working outside the accepted structures of their time." That letter was never published during Dr. Weiss's lifetime. It was found among his papers after his death in 1967, just one more quiet voice wondering if science had been too quick to dismiss what it could not explain. A particularly intriguing footnote to the Murphy case emerged in 1963 when biochemist Dr. Elena Vasquez attempted to recreate the sisters' vital essence accumulator based on the descriptions in Elizabeth's notes. Using modern materials and techniques, Dr. Vasquez constructed a device that she believed approximated the original design. Her experiment, conducted at the University of California, involved separating blood components and passing them through a series of specialized filters before reintroducing them to test subjects, laboratory mice in this case. The results, published in an obscure journal and largely ignored by the scientific establishment, showed statistically significant increases in activity levels, feeding behaviors, and stress responses in recipient mice. More surprisingly, recipients of multiple transfers from the same donor began to exhibit behavioral patterns more typical of the donor than of their own baseline. Dr. Vasquez wrote, "While I make no claims regarding vital essence or life energy, the data clearly indicate that something beyond the known cellular components is being transferred in this process. The behavioral mimicry observed in recipients suggests the transmission of information that influences neurological function in ways we don't yet understand." Her paper concluded with a provocative statement. Perhaps the Murphy sisters, limited by the scientific understanding of their time, were attempting to describe a phenomenon for which they had no adequate terminology. Their vital essence may well be what we would now recognize as a complex interaction of hormones, proteins, and cellular signaling mechanisms. Their error was not in their observations, but in their explanatory framework. Like Dr. Patel before her, Dr. Vasquez found herself marginalized after publishing her work on the Murphy case. Her funding was not renewed, and she eventually abandoned this line of research, moving instead into more conventional studies of blood chemistry. Her experimental apparatus was dismantled, and her raw data, stored on punch cards typical of early computer systems, was lost during a laboratory relocation in 1966. Another curious connection to the Murphy sisters emerged in 1962 when archaeologist Dr. Howard Jenkins was conducting an excavation of a small cemetery on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. The cemetery, associated with the property that had once housed the Montgomery boarding house, was being relocated due to highway construction. Among the graves was one marked only with the initials M.W. Inside the simple coffin, preservation conditions had been unusually favorable, and several artifacts remained intact. Most notable among these was a small glass vial on a silver chain worn around the neck of the deceased. The vial contained traces of a substance that, when analyzed, was found to consist primarily of blood plasma with unusual protein markers that the technicians could not readily identify. Dr. Jenkins, aware of Dr. Caldwell's research on the Murphy sisters, contacted her to share his finding. In a joint paper published in a regional historical journal, they proposed that M.W. was most likely Margaret Murphy, living under her assumed identity of Margaret Wilson, and that the vial represented a sample of the vital essence the sisters had claimed to manipulate. This interpretation remains speculative, as no definitive identification of the remains was ever established. However, carbon dating placed the burial between 1870 and 1880, consistent with the time the Murphy sisters were known to be operating in Charleston under their assumed names. The most recent chapter in the Murphy sisters saga came in 1968 when novelist and amateur historian Patricia Lawson published The Energy Harvesters, The Murphy Sisters, and the Dawn of Bioenergetic Medicine. Lawson's book attempted to rehabilitate the sisters' reputation, portraying them as misunderstood pioneers whose work anticipated later developments in fields ranging from blood banking to psychoneuroimmunology. While Lawson's book was more rigorously researched than Stanton's earlier novel, it still took significant interpretive liberties. Most controversially, she suggested that the Murphy sisters had discovered a method for transferring not just physical vitality, but specific personality traits and even memories between individuals. Lawson wrote, "Consider the implications of Elizabeth Murphy's observation that recipients began to display characteristics of their donors after multiple transfers? What if the vital essence they identified carried not just energy but information, the patterns that make each of us uniquely ourselves? If so, they had discovered something far more profound than a mere medical treatment. They had found a way to transfer aspects of the self from one person to another. This claim, unsupported by any documented evidence, was dismissed by serious historians and scientists. However, it captured the public imagination and contributed to the Murphy sisters' enduring place in the folklore of New Orleans and in discussions of women's contributions to medical history. In the decades since Lawson's book, little new information has emerged about the Murphy sisters or their work. Occasional articles appear in historical journals, typically reassessing existing evidence rather than presenting new discoveries. The sisters are sometimes cited in feminist histories of medicine as examples of women whose contributions were minimized or erased by the male-dominated scientific establishment of their time. What remains most fascinating about the Murphy case is not just the mystery itself, but what it reveals about the intersection of science, gender, and authority in 19th century America. Three women, educated but uncredentialed, operating outside established medical institutions, claim to have made a revolutionary discovery. That claim was dismissed, their work destroyed, and their very existence nearly erased from the historical record. Were they charlatans exploiting the vulnerable? Visionaries ahead of their time? Something in between? The evidence allows for multiple interpretations, and in that ambiguity lies the enduring appeal of their story. Dr. Caldwell, reflecting on her decades of research into the case, wrote shortly before her death in 1969, "I began this investigation believing I would expose a historical curiosity, perhaps a case of 19th century medical fraud perpetrated by unusual female practitioners. I conclude it with the uncomfortable sense that something genuinely significant may have been lost when the Murphy sisters were forced to abandon their work and flee New Orleans. The question that haunts me is not whether they were right or wrong in their theories, but whether we will ever know what they actually discovered. The Murphy sisters and their work represent a road not taken in medical history, a path of investigation that, whether valid or misguided, was cut short before it could be properly evaluated. Their story raises questions about how knowledge is validated, whose observations are deemed worthy of serious consideration, and what might be rediscovered if we revisit the discarded ideas of the past with modern understanding. And so the Murphy sisters remain in that gray area between historical footnote and scientific mystery. Their work, whatever its true nature, vanished with them into the fog of time and deliberate obscurity. All that remains are questions, fragmented records, and the nagging sense that something significant happened in that house on Dauphine Street, something that science of the 1860s refused to accept, and that perhaps even modern science has not fully revisited or understood. In 1965, a graduate student in history at Tulane University, Michael Devereaux, discovered a brief reference to the Murphy sisters in the private correspondence of Dr. William Spencer, the Union Army's chief medical officer who had originally investigated them. In a letter to a colleague in Boston dated March 1864, Spencer wrote, "The Murphy matter continues to trouble me. While I publicly dismiss their claims as feminine hysteria and pseudo-scientific nonsense, I cannot shake the memory of what I observed in their laboratory. The woman on the table, who I was assured was a willing participant, exhibited a glow of health immediately following the procedure that I have never before witnessed in any patient. More disturbing still, the donor from whom they had extracted something displayed symptoms that defied conventional explanation. It was as if some vital aspect had been temporarily removed from her being, leaving a shell that was alive yet diminished. I find myself wondering, against all scientific reason, if there might be some validity to their outlandish claims." Spencer's letter was never answered, at least not in any correspondence that has survived. Shortly after writing it, he was reassigned to a field hospital in Virginia, where he served until the war's end. His official reports on the Murphy case maintained the dismissive tone expected of a medical man of his era when confronted with female practitioners operating outside established norms. Yet that private moment of doubt, expressed to a trusted colleague, suggests that even those who publicly rejected the Murphy sisters' work may have privately harbored uncertainties about what they had witnessed. As the 20th century progressed, new scientific developments occasionally sparked renewed interest in the Murphy case. The discovery of hormones in the early 1900s, the development of blood fractionation techniques in the 1940s, the growing understanding of immune function and cellular communication pathways, each advance offered new possible interpretations of what the sisters might have been observing in their crude 19th century laboratory. Dr. Robert Thornton, writing in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1963, noted, "It is tempting to dismiss historical cases like that of the Murphy sisters as mere curiosities, products of a less enlightened age. Yet the history of medicine is full of instances where observations made without the benefit of modern understanding later proved to contain kernels of important truth." The Murphy sisters' descriptions of vital essence transfer and its effects, stripped of their metaphysical language, bear striking resemblances to phenomena we now recognize in relation to hormone therapy, plasma exchange, and cellular signaling. This periodic re-examination of the Murphy case represents a pattern common in the history of science, the reconsideration of discarded ideas in light of new understanding. Sometimes, as with Ignaz Semmelweis's work on hand washing or Gregor Mendel's genetics research, ideas initially rejected by the scientific establishment are later vindicated. Other times, re-examination confirms the original dismissal. The Murphy case remains in limbo, neither fully rehabilitated nor conclusively debunked. In the absence of definitive evidence, the Murphy sisters have acquired a somewhat mythological status in certain circles. Among practitioners of alternative medicine, they are sometimes cited as early pioneers whose work was suppressed by conventional medical authorities. In feminist histories, they represent women whose contributions were minimized due to their gender. In New Orleans folklore, they have joined the pantheon of mysterious figures who add to the city's reputation for the unusual and uncanny. The house on Dauphine Street still stands, though it has been renovated many times over the intervening century and a half. Current owners report no unusual occurrences, no lingering sense of the building's mysterious past. The basement where the Murphy sisters conducted their experiments is now a casual dining area in a tourist-friendly bed and breakfast. Occasionally, guests familiar with the story ask about the Murphy sisters' house, but most staff members know little beyond vague details of some medical ladies who once lived there. Time has softened the edges of the mystery, reduced it to little more than local color in a city already rich with tales of the unusual and unexplained. A small brass plaque added to the building's exterior in 2001 as part of a historical walking tour provides a brief sanitized summary of the sisters and their work. It makes no mention of vital essence or energy transfer, describing them simply as practitioners of women's medicine who contributed to the rich tapestry of New Orleans medical history. In the humid air of the French Quarter, where the past never quite releases its hold on the present, perhaps some echo of their work remains, not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural persistence, but in the simple human reluctance to accept that some mysteries may never be solved, some knowledge may never be recovered, and some truths may remain forever just beyond our grasp. The next time you walk down Dauphine Street, pause for a moment near the old Murphy house. It looks like any other well-maintained historic home now, with no indication of what once occurred within its walls. But perhaps, in that moment of reflection, you might wonder what those three educated, determined women believed they had discovered, and whether, somewhere in their meticulous notes and careful experiments, they had glimpsed some truth that the world wasn't yet ready to accept. In 1965, neurologist Dr. Samuel Weiss wrote in a private letter to a colleague, "What if the Murphy women were right? What if they had discovered some method of transferring biological components that enhance cellular function? The ethical questions would be troubling, certainly, but the scientific implications would be profound. Sometimes I wonder if we've dismissed them too easily, simply because they were women working outside the accepted structures of their time. That letter was never published during Dr. Weiss's lifetime. It was found among his papers after his death in 1967. Just one more quiet voice wondering if science had been too quick to dismiss what it could not explain. As with so many historical mysteries, the final truth about the Murphy sisters likely died with those who lived it. Agnes took whatever secrets she had to her grave in Alexandria. Elizabeth's fate is documented, but the full extent of her knowledge remains unknown. And Margaret, well, Margaret simply vanished as completely as the research that the sisters so carefully destroyed before they fled New Orleans. What remains is a compelling story that reminds us how the boundaries of science are constantly shifting, how knowledge that seems impossible in one era may become commonplace in another, and how easily the contributions of those who work outside established systems can be overlooked or deliberately erased. The sinister case of the Murphy sisters, the case that science refused to accept, remains unsolved. But perhaps in that very lack of resolution lies its greatest value, a reminder that certainty is often an illusion, that knowledge has its limits, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries come from those bold enough to venture beyond the boundaries of accepted understanding.